So, it's been quite some time since I've made my last theory video, and after seeing quite a few requests, I think it's time to get back into it. And what better way to start than with how the Splatoon world is in a never-ending loop of predestination and eternal torment. That's right, today we are talking about a time paradox. So we're gonna get into some heavy stuff here, like, if you're a little prone to dealing with existential issues, then beware, this episode might set off a bit of your anxiety. So with that warning out of the way, let's introduce what a time paradox is for those who don't know. To describe a time paradox in this context, I'm going to give you a pretty simple example. Say you come into possession of a time machine and you go back in time and for some reason you shoot your grandfather before the conception of your father. That creates a time paradox, because if your dad doesn't exist, then how can you exist? That's a rhetorical question. For your own mental stability, do not try to figure that out. This question in general is one of the reasons that time travel is considered science fiction and not scientifically possible. So don't think about time travel, think about Splatoon. See, look, the funny squids are back on screen, don't go crazy. But now that we've got that established, we need to figure out what this has to do with Splatoon, and that comes down to two major images that we've seen in both Splatoon 1 and Splatoon 2. In Splatoon 1, there is a sunken scroll of a dead human who is very visibly killed while playing Splatoon. Now you might be thinking, there's no way to actually prove that he's playing Splatoon. The only disc in this area is upside down. Well, however, there is actually a smoking gun in this image that confirms that this person was indeed playing Splatoon. Look at the Wii U Pro controller. Notice how it's got a Wii remote tied to it? This isn't a coincidence or just something really weird. This was an actual tip that Nintendo gave on how to use motion controls on the Wii U Pro controller for Splatoon 1. No, I'm not kidding. Here's the article from Nintendo's Splatoon Tumblr where they tell people that to use motion controls without the gamepad, then they need to tie a Wiimote and tie it to the Pro controller to get motion controls for the controller since they didn't originally come with it. Also, you don't need to tell me how stupid this sounds, I think it's just as dumb as you do. The stupid piece of advice being shown here is, however, the proof that we need to show that the Splatoon game does exist in the Splatoon world. But that's not the only piece of evidence we have. In Splatoon 2 Arowana Mall, in one of the shops you can actually see a copy of the album Splatoon being sold. If you didn't know what Splatoon is spelled S-P-L-A-T-U-N-E, it's the Splatoon 1 OST, which is being sold to Inklings, meaning that the Splatoon OST was somehow created either after Inkling Society got large, or it's been being reproduced since Inklings found Splatoon. Either way, the possibility here leads us to really messy outcomes. One being that Splatoon was either created by Inklings and then sent back to humans, or that Inklings have found Splatoon and have been living their lives accordingly to the game. I mean, we've seen before how Inklings have mimicked what they've seen with humans with their very obviously Egyptian phase, but the next question I'd like to pose, however, if Splatoon 1 clearly exists in the Splatoon world, what about Splatoon 2, or Splatoon 3 for that matter? Well, that's kind of what puts this time paradox theory to rest. To my knowledge, we haven't seen any proof that Splatoon 2, the game, exists in Splatoon 2. And because this human was killed while playing Splatoon 1, I think it's safe to say that Splatoon 2 and 3 didn't get the chance to exist in this timeline. What this does also do, however, is bring us to the answer of our theory. I overlooked something from earlier. That human was playing Splatoon 1 on a Wii U, but that's not exactly a Wii U. It's got some very different characteristics than the Wii U we have today, but in the end it's still a Wii U nonetheless. A Wii U that just happens to have Splatoon on it. My theory to tie this all together isn't just that Splatoon world is some alternate version of Earth, it's a full-on alternate timeline that Nintendo is aware of and actively expanding on. Think about it. If we assume that nothing has changed about Splatoon 1's release date, then that shows us that the Great Flood took place in 2015. If World War II still ended in 1945, stick with me here, it all comes back around, then that is around 70 years between the end of World War II and the Great Flood, which gives us our time period of when our 3 bonus World Wars took place. To circle back to the Wii U, this thing is not as sleek looking as the Wii U we have today, and on the contrary, the technology we see that humans use to fight wars with seems to be more advanced than what our modern day soldiers are using, showing emphasis on humans leading more into development of weapons rather than everyday commodities. We already know that humans in the Splatoon world had more weapons, but what hasn't been connected until now was its effects on consumer technology, as the Wii U here looks much more like a prototype of its design than anything that ever would have been released. Meaning here that the world has been more focused on better ways to wage war than to actually make things that people would use. Alright, so to loop it back around, it looks like we're dealing with two separate realities that have one common link: Nintendo. I didn't say Splatoon, and that's intentional, and we'll get back to that. If you're unaware, the bomb launchers in Splatoon 2 are actually toys that Nintendo produced. It's called the Ultra Machine, and also, if you didn't know, Nintendo is canon to Splatoon. Nintendo is a brand in Splatoon that produces all of the N-Zaps and bomb launchers. This would make Nintendo as the last known business to survive the destruction of the human world, though it's much more likely that Inklings discovered Nintendo and then just decided to take up their name when making their brand. But regardless, we have more links linking together Nintendo as one of the sole connections between our timeline and the Splatoon timeline. And to touch on what I said a bit ago, Splatoon the game is one of these connections. Splatoon as a game appears to be made by Nintendo before the Great Flood, and though there could be differences in our Splatoon and the actual Splatoon Timeline's version of Splatoon, it looks like there aren't too many, because if features as stupid as tying controllers together for motion controls made it to the other game, then I think it's really likely that the games are near identical. I could go on and on trying to explain the events that took place in the Splatoon game that also took place in the Splatoon world. This video could go on for hours then, and while it would certainly be good for my viewer retention time, the conclusion can be summed up pretty easily, and it all just kinda comes down to two classic debates. Does life imitate art, or does art imitate life? And which came first, the chicken or the egg? And like I said earlier, you will go crazy trying to answer some of these questions, and it's just not worth it. So, to finally conclude for real this time, there are some wacky timeline shenanigans going on between our reality and the Splatoon reality, and one of the biggest things that link the two together is the fact that Splatoon 1 exists in both. It doesn't appear that the other Splatoon games like Splatoon 2, Octo Expansion, or Splatoon 3 were made before the Great Flood, but the first game definitely does exist, and if we assume that the Great Flood happened in 2015, then we can also find out the time span of when all the other three world wars took place. It also implies that a difference between our timeline and the Splatoon timeline exists in terms of their military and consumer technology. Where we have better consumer technology and less advanced military technology, they have the opposite. We don't know if our Splatoon game and the Splatoon timeline Splatoon game are identical, but they seem pretty similar. And finally, we are never going to really know why the Splatoon game in the Splatoon world is there unless Nintendo gives us more information on it, which we have no idea if they'll ever do, because really they probably only mean an Easter egg by this. But the little Easter egg they made has a very big amount of implications for the Splatoon world. While Splatoon existing in our reality has little implication on us, it has a massive ramification for the Splatoon world, and could honestly bring up some discussion on predestination being a thing in the Splatoon world. But that's all for today, gamers. If your head's spinning around after this one, then drop a like, because it means I've entertained you well, and why not subscribe while you're at it? It guarantees that I can give you even more existential dread at a later date. Alright gamers, that is it from me. See ya.